Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Bellingham Covenant Church. My name is Phil Rushton, the lead pastor here, and glad that you're tuning in this morning. We're having one of our outdoor services this Sunday, and because of that, we aren't live streaming our service. It's a little bit of work to move all that equipment out, but I know some of you are on the road or are home and unable to be here, so I wanted to pre-record this sermon so that you could continue in our series on Nehemiah and stay connected with us this week. I began a series a couple weeks ago on the book of Nehemiah, and today we find ourselves in chapter 4. To begin our time, I'd like to read through the first part of chapter 4, and we're going to reference other parts of the chapter as well this morning. So let's listen in. This is Nehemiah chapter 4. We're going to read verses 1 through 9 as we begin our time together. So we read, when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates in the army of Samaria, he said, "What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are?" Tobiah, the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, "What are they building? Even a fox climbing up on it would break down their wall of stones." "Hear us, our God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders." So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, and the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod heard that the reports to Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. But we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. Friends in Christ, this is the word of the Lord. As we have been navigating this series, we recall that the story of Nehemiah is a story of rebuilding and renewal. This is the part of the biblical drama where the Israelites are welcomed back to Jerusalem, and they are on this journey of rebuilding the city. The story, though, is not just a story of physical reconstruction. It is a time of spiritual reconstruction and renewal. When Nehemiah heard that the rebuilding efforts were not going well, he had a heart for his people, and a vision was born out of this lament. God opened this door for him to go and be part of this reconstructing work. But what we discover in chapter 4 is that as he now steps into this vision, he begins to face resistance, and he begins to face opposition. I want to speak into the ways that we often face opposition en route to our preferred future as we step into the vision we have for our life, personally, corporately, in work or home or church. It seems inevitable that along the way we get discouraged or we face opposition or resistance. How do we navigate that? How do we persevere through that? I think we all can point to that in our own experience. I think we have an annual rhythm of this. I don't know about you, but I often have a very ambitious vision for life when the new year comes. And a lot of times that's a time where we reflect and we set goals. We have a vision for becoming healthy or moving in new ways, starting new rhythms. But as we know, a lot of times come February, we fall back, we slip back into those old patterns. We struggle to live into our vision. I actually read a report a while back that said about 95% of our resolutions fail by February. So if that's your experience, you're in good company. It seems to be the human condition. And so I want to engage that. How can we overcome the discouragement? How can we move past the resistance we face en route to realizing our vision, or the vision that God has given us? So as we encounter in our text, these two characters become very prominent in the story of of Nehemiah, Sanballat and Tobiah. They are regional leaders, and the rebuilding of Jerusalem is threatening to them. It is threatening their sense of power, their control, what they want to see happen in the region. And so they proceed to try and dishearten and demoralize the Israelite people. We discover for the Israelites that part of the opposition they face is coming from an external source. They face this external opposition from Sanballat and Tobiah. These two local politicians begin with attempting to demoralize them through words. And so we read in our text today the way they taunted the Israelites, tried to sow seeds of self-doubt. These feeble Jews, will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from these heaps of rubble, burned as they are? And then Tobiah adds into the mix that a fox climbing it will just break their wall of stones. And we see how they offer these words of discouragement. You're not enough. You can't do it. You're going to fail. Tries to dishearten the people. Now, the initial response by the Israelites is to persist in their work, and they had a heart for the work, it says, and they continued halfway through the construction. But then the external opposition continues, and Sanballat and Tobiah do not let up. When words are not enough, they now threaten force. And so they begin to gather troops from local tribes that threaten the work of the Israelites with war. What we discover is that along the way, this external discouragement then becomes an internal type of opposition or discouragement. The words, the actions, the threats eventually get to the people of Israel. We didn't read the rest of chapter 4, but as it goes on in verse 10, it says, "Meanwhile, the people in Judah said, 'The strength of the laborers is giving out, and there is so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall.'" What we start to see is that the opposition, the resistance, the discouragement is internalized now, and they're starting to express self-doubt, wondering whether they can finish this work. En route to this preferred vision, opposition, resistance threatens to bring the project to a halt. I want to connect this to our experience because I think we do face various experiences of resistance and opposition. Some of us do face that external type of resistance. As we seek to bring about change, sometimes that can be threatening for other people. En route to a preferred vision, there's some people that may not want to see that happen. I just had like this internal reflection about how I would react if Julie wanted to make major changes to our life at home. I just had this funny thought of coming home one day and she said, I think it would be healthy for our family if we canceled our internet service and started a vegan diet, right? In response to change, I'd probably be resistant because that's going to make my life uncomfortable. I don't know how I feel about that, right? Change is received in different ways from people that might be threatened by a vision. And that's the case for Nehemiah. I think sometimes we bump into that. And maybe there are people who are speaking words of discouragement to you as you're seeking to move in a new direction. Others might be threatened by that. There's a common phrase called NIMBY right now, not in my backyard. And sometimes when there are proposals for new types of development in a neighborhood, people are threatened by that vision. It might threaten their property values. That's kind of what's happening for Sanballat. He's saying, not in my backyard. This building construction project is getting in the way of what I would like to see. I was at a neighborhood meeting actually just this Tuesday where there's been a proposal for some mixed income housing, multifamily housing in our neighborhood. And it was just interesting to see that dynamic at play as property owners were on this Zoom call voicing all kinds of concerns and complaints about how this might affect their property, their desires, their interests. Sometimes we face external opposition, and I wonder if you're experiencing that in one way or another right now, in the workplace, en route to a ministry dream that you have, a personal goal that you have? Are there other people that are speaking words maybe of discouragement or uncomfortable with the changes that you want to bring? At the same time, I think a lot of times the resistance, a lot of times the opposition, like the people in Judah, comes internally. We tend to be our own worst critics, and we internalize the language that we hear from Sanballat and Tobiah. There's a study done that was referenced by the psychologist Les Parrott, where he said that 77%, over 3/4 of our self-talk is negative. The tapes we're playing in our heads are ones of discouragement. We're often the ones that say things like, "You're too feeble. This is going to fail. This is going to come crumbling down. You can't do that." I just want to name that today. And I wonder if that's something you're battling in your own experience today, that you're feeling discouraged en route to realizing a vision for change in your life. What I want to engage through this text is how we counter those voices. How do we move beyond the resistance, beyond the discouragement as we seek to live into the various visions that we have for our life? And I notice in our text some really significant ways that God works through the life of Nehemiah to help reorient the people in a direction of hope as they persevere in this work. We notice some of the ways that we, I believe, can counter discouragement and resistance. The first thing I want to notice in our text today is that Nehemiah seeks to overcome this discouragement through the practice of prayer. Now, we've named this a couple times already in our sermon series, and what I've noticed this time going through Nehemiah is how often prayer shows up. That this is a deep reflex in Nehemiah's life. That he tends to counter the words of discouragement or the words of grief by turning to the Lord in prayer. Instead of listening to those voices, he remembers, he prays, he turns to God. And that helps reorient his perspective, reorient his life. As I said a couple weeks ago, prayer is more for us than it is for God. We are the one that changes, shifts as we turn to the Lord in prayer. And this is an important point, I think, for us to make, because sometimes the book of Nehemiah can, if we're not careful, be reduced to a series of leadership principles, and we can take God out of the equation. And sometimes we can even deify Nehemiah and see him as this great example that we should just try and follow. But Nehemiah himself regularly shows us that he needs something beyond himself. That he cannot lead without the intervention of God, without tending to his own communication with the Lord. It is prayer that guides this whole process. And that is the same here in our text in chapter 4. And so we read, in response to Sanballat and Tobiah, he prays, "Hear us, O God, for we are despised." But then we go on to read the nature of his prayer, and I want to engage this because it's a bit of an intense prayer. I want to just listen to this and wrestle a little bit with how Nehemiah prays. "Hear us, our God, for we are despised." And then he goes on to get frustrated with his enemies, turn their insults back on their own heads, give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders. Now, upon first read, this prayer might seem a little off-putting to us, a little bit concerning, because Nehemiah doesn't pull any punches here. He vents his anger and his frustration. He doesn't want God to even forgive his enemies. He wants them to be the recipients of captivity and to be plundered and so on. What do we do with prayers like this? We encounter this sometimes in the Psalms when David gets very violent in his prayers as he's venting and as he is angry about his enemies. Now, on one level, I think there's something healthy that is modeled here for us by Nehemiah. That instead of taking vengeance on himself. He actually hands it back to the Lord. And I think these types of prayers, these imprecatory prayers, have the effect of maybe diffusing some of the malice, the violence, the anger in our hearts. There's something healthy, I think, about being able to vent and be honest. And through that, Nehemiah in many ways is handing that back to God to be the God of justice. He's not going to take justice in his own hands. And perhaps even through the venting process, his anger is worked through, it is diffused in his life. So on the one hand, I think there's space for that in our prayers, for that radical honesty. At the same time, I think we need to recognize that as followers of Christ, we are ultimately supposed to have a different disposition to our enemies. That in this phase of redemptive history, we have new tools by which to respond to those who hurt us as we have encountered Jesus and his response on the cross. And so this is how Derek Kidner in his background commentary summarizes what we do with this prayer. He says, well, the Christian has been shown a better answer to evil, and so we don't follow Nehemiah's heart towards his enemies to its full extent here. We can, as Christians, learn from Nehemiah to look to God, not to ourselves, for vindication. I think there's something significant in this prayer, while also just naming that we are called ultimately to a different response to evil as followers of Christ. Nehemiah responds to opposition, to discouragement through prayer. That is the reflex in his heart. And I want to just extend that to you. I think in times of discouragement, we can be so focused on the voices of others, of those internal voices of discouragement. And prayer, I think, has a capacity to reorient our hearts. We begin to focus on God, who is bigger than our enemies, bigger than our opposition, instead of being fixated on what causes us fear. Prayer is one of the ways we navigate the opposition we face. The second thing I want to pull out from this text is very similar, and it's almost the same point, but it's just another layer to it, where Nehemiah also leads the people in a time of remembrance of who God is. He proclaims to the people the nature of God. And so this comes up later in chapter 4, where we read this, and he's speaking to his fellow countrymen who are in a place of deep discouragement, who have lost heart. Do not be afraid of them. Instead, remember the Lord, who is great and awesome. Do not be afraid, but replace that fear by remembrance of the Lord, who is great and awesome. And this then gives them the courage to respond and to defend and continue their work. I think this remembrance, is a helpful reorientation for us. In times of discouragement, where we're perhaps demoralized, losing sight of the vision, it is helpful, I think, to look back on the way God has intervened in our life in the past. For Nehemiah, I think it was important in these times for him to remember that strong sense of call, to not give up hope in the face of these hard things. I think there's a danger here for Nehemiah to allow the voice of Sanballat and Tobiah to dominate his mind and heart. Instead, he remembers the God who he believes in, the God who is great and powerful, the God who has intervened in the past and who he believes will intervene in the present of their enemies right now. And so can we lift that up as a practice, this practice of praise, of gratitude? May that drive out the fear, drive out the angst. We did a kid's illustration I think a couple of years ago now, where Charity had this bucket of water, and it represented the fear that sometimes dominates our lives. And then together, we had the kids and adults name some of the things that they were grateful for and some of the attributes of God, and we just dropped those rocks into the pitcher, and slowly it displaced the fear. And it was this beautiful illustration, a simple one, but a beautiful one, in the way that the practice of praise, the practice of gratitude, the practice of remembrance can displace the fear that tends to accumulate in our hearts and minds. I'd invite us into that practice to speak back to the discouragement through remembrance, through praise, through gratitude. The third thing that I think is notable for us as we seek to persevere, push through, overcome resistance, is that the Israelites persist in their work. There's this very jolting turn from the prayer that in verse 6 where we read this. So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height. There's a small pivot in this text that I think is actually very profound. So they pray, but then they persist. So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height. I think sometimes this is a word we need to hear, to just continue to move forward in the vision that we believe God has given us. When we are discouraged, this is not a time to change directions. This is a word from Eric Mason in his commentary. Whatever the last thing was that God revealed to you to do it. Don't try and come up with something new to do. Don't let opposition change what God told you to do. When we're facing discouragement, when we're facing opposition, I think this isn't a time for us to give up on those plans, but to push forward in them. Ignatius of Loyola, in his writings on discernment, says that we shouldn't change course in the places of desolation because we can't really trust that that's of God. Let's go back to those times and remember where we did have a sense of peace, where we did have a sense of God's leading, and continue to follow that trajectory. I think that's just a helpful encouragement to us in these times to keep moving forward, to not let these voices win out. Well, the last thing I want to engage, and I think this is just such a significant point that comes up throughout the book of Nehemiah. It came up last week as well, but Nehemiah recognizes in this time that he needs support. When he is facing opposition, when he is facing resistance, this is a time to lean into community. As the Proverbs say, it's just that cord of many strands that cannot be broken. We need to reach out for help. I didn't do a whole sermon on chapter 3. I referenced it last week and want to reference it again here, but we discover in chapter 3 how many people are part of this vision. It's this beautiful representation of the whole community making sacrifices for the project. The priests and the religious leaders are getting their hands dirty. They're leading the way by example, but it's not just the leaders that are doing it. It is local craftsmen. It is young people. It is men and women. There's this beautiful list of the whole people of God supporting the effort. I think in these times of opposition, this is a time where we recognize we need one another to resist the opposition, to resist the discouragement. There's this beautiful moment at the end of chapter 4 where we read this in verse 19. Then I said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, the work is extensive and spread out, and we are widely separated from each other along the wall. Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, join us there, and our God will fight for us. Throughout the rest of chapter 4, they are coming up with plans to defend themselves while they continue to rebuild the wall. And they come up with this plan that when they see that the enemy is advancing, when they're spread out, they're going to blow the trumpet and they're going to come together so that together they can resist, with God's help, the onslaught of their enemies. I just think this is a beautiful image that we need those calls to come back to one another in times of resistance, in times of opposition. And I think this can apply to us in a couple of ways. On one level, some of us may need to ask this question, where do I need support? Who are those people I need to reach out to come close to gather in my experience of discouragement? We learn a lot about this for those who are in recovery. That recovery groups recognize the need for sponsors and accountability groups. We need to regularly regather and connect so that we can resist the forces we're up against in community. And maybe that's a question that you need to wrestle with today. Where is your community? Who do you need to come close to? Do you need support? Do you need mentors? Do you need accountability? Do you need that support in your life? But I think this also applies to us on the other level. I think some of us also need to ask this question: who am I called to support? Who is in need in my life that I need to come close to, that is vulnerable, who is weak, that needs the support of friends? I think that's an important thing for us to reflect on. We see throughout this story that Nehemiah carries the pain of his people, and he steps into their experience to come alongside them, to rebuild, to encourage them. And I wonder whose pain you are called to tend to carry. Who are you called to reach out to this week? I think it's as we gather together that we can withstand the resistance, the discouragement that inevitably comes our way. Friends, the story of Nehemiah is very clear that whenever we make advances for the kingdom of God, we will and ought to expect resistance, expect discouragement. Jesus said as much in the Gospels: in this world you will face trouble. 2 Timothy 3 talks about the inevitability of pushback, of persecution as we move forward for God's vision for this world. And because of that, I think we just need to be prepared, equipped with a life of prayer, with a life of remembrance, with a life of support and community. May we continue to gather so that when we are spread out, we will be equipped and nourished for the work that awaits us. I really see an image of the church in this verse 19, that we regularly do need to come and gather, have these rallying points where we're encouraged, where we're nurtured, where we're supported, so that when we're spread out doing the extensive work of the kingdom of God in our various spheres of influence, that we will be supported and we know we can come back when we need encouragement. I pray that God might meet you in those places of discouragement today, in those places where you are facing resistance, and that he might, again, equip you, encourage you to persevere for the vision he has given you as we work together for the kingdom of God. God bless, and I pray God's blessing on you as you step into your work this week.